This is CNN Breaking News.
Hello and welcome to our viewers in the US and around the world. I'm Max Foster in London. This is CNN Newsroom and we begin with breaking news. North Korea saying it successfully tested an intercontinental ballistic missile. Earlier in a televised announcement, Pyongyang said Kim Jong-un ordered the tests. This comes hours after it launched the missile that may have landed in Japan's exclusive economic zone. South Korea's military says it landed in the waters east of the Korean peninsula after travelling some 930 kilometres, or about 600 miles. US President Donald Trump reacted to the launch on Twitter. North Korea has just launched another missile. Does this guy have anything better to do with his life? Hard to believe that South Korea and Japan will put up with this much longer. Perhaps China will put a heavy move on North Korea and end this nonsense once and for all. CNN is following this developing story for you with our correspondents in the region. Paula Hancock is in Seoul. Journalist Kaori and Joji joins us from Tokyo, and Andrew Stevens is in Hong Kong. But Paula, first to you. Just take us through the vital statistics here on what we know.
Well, Max, North Korea has claimed it had a successful test of an ICBM, an Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. There was an announcement just half an hour ago. They triumphantly, by a news anchor, said that it was called the Hwasong 14. They say that the order for this test came directly from the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, and he was at the test site as well when it was tested. We did see on North Korean television a photo of the North Korean leader signing something. We assume that was the test order. This is something that we have seen North Korea do in the past as well, and then showing an image of his signature. It also says that it was conducted at 9 a.m. Pyongyang time, so it's about 4.5 hours ago. Now the missile travelled for 39 minutes for just over 930 kilometres, the altitude just over 2,800 kilometres. Now, as far as North Korea is concerned, it has successfully test-fired an ICBM. Experts now going through those numbers, trying to figure out if technically it is an ICBM, but they are saying that it is a historic event for North Korea. North Korea in that announcement also saying that they can now, with this ICBM, hit anywhere in the world. Now, this is a North Korean claim that they can hit anywhere in the world. Certainly experts will be looking to see how far the exact range would be for that, though, and also saying that North Korea is a nuclear state and will defend its nation against US threats. So this will be of great concern to all countries in the region. It will be of great concern to the United States as well, Max, the fact that North Korea claims it does have an ICBM.
This is something Donald Trump said he would never let happen, isn't it? And South Korea being the US key ally in that region, what are they saying about this?
Well, we had a reaction from before the North Korean claim from the President Moon Jae-in, the South Korean president, just after he had a National Security Council meeting. And he's the one that really first officially alerted the fact that it could have been an ICBM, saying that's what the military was looking at. And he said that if that's the case, then South Korea would look for appropriate action. Now, we don't know what that appropriate action is at this point. It's difficult to see what more South Korea would be able to do beyond maybe sanctions, going to the United Nations Security Council, asking for another resolution, asking for tighter sanctions. But we've certainly heard in recent days from President Moon, when he was in Washington meeting with President Trump of the United States, that he wanted North Korea to come back to the negotiating table. During his statement in front of the world's media, while standing next to the US president, he had a direct call to North Korea saying, come back to the negotiating table. It's difficult to see how that would be possible now, given the fact they have done an ICBM test. But President Moon also saying that he was disappointed that this came just a few days after that summit, but saying there would be appropriate action. We simply don't know what that is at this point. Max.
OK, let's go to the other ally then, US ally there in the region, Japan. Let's go to Tokyo and speak to Kaori. Kaori, what sort of response are we getting from them there? What sort of action do they want in response to this?
Well, a strong protest from the Prime Minister and the Japanese government this morning regarding this latest missile launch from North Korea. And the language used by the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has been noticeably strong, calling it a clear sign that the threat from North Korea is increasing. Growing frustration, I think, amongst the leaders here from within the Japanese cabinet, particularly because this missile launch comes just a day after a telephone conversation between the Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and the U.S. President Donald Trump, trying to present a united front and trying to present that cooperation is intact to try and deter North Korea from conducting these missile tests. And I think the timing, of course, as the leaders head out to Hamburg for the G20 meeting, of course, noticed, of course, of importance in the Prime Minister saying that he would go to the G20 this week and call for more what he called constructive action from both countries like China and Russia to try and contain this crisis. So I think a great sense of alarm and frustration here in Japan, especially if it did land in the exclusive economic zone, which is about 370 kilometers off the coast of the western shores of Japan, not the least of which because it is frequented by ships and aircraft from the region. So a very strong response and a quick response today from the Japanese leader regarding this North Korean missile launch.
Is it likely that Japan would support U.S. military action against North Korea?
I think it's too early to say, but as you know, the U.S.-Japan alliance, the security alliance, is the bedrock of Japan's national security agenda. So I think since the U.S. president came into office, the Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has made it clear that he wants to provide a very united front, that this cooperation is intact. And I think Japan has tried to play the role of a mediator because so many nations are involved in this area at a very critical stage.
Well, thank you for that, and all eyes really on that US reaction, but also crucially the Chinese reaction, because Andrew, it's probably true to say, isn't it, that Donald Trump's going to say China needs to step up now.
It'd be very surprising if he said something different, Max. And China, as yet, has not made a public comment about the launch, and B, news that North Korea is claiming it's an ICBM. But all along, China has said very clearly, A, that it does want to see a denuclearised Korean Peninsula, and B, the best way forward is through dialogue. And that is not what Donald Trump has been talking about. He's saying that China needs to step up on the economic front. And Mr. Trump is right in that China continues to hold the key to pressure on North Korea so much more than any other country, just because of its economic relationship. It's got 90% of North Korea's foreign trade, just to give you an idea just how important it is. China will say, we are doing everything under the sanctions which have been laid out by the United Nations. We are being a party to that, so don't expect us to go beyond that. It now comes down to dialogue. Interestingly, the new ambassador from China to the United Nations was speaking less than 24 hours ago about dialogue. Just listen to what he had to say, Max.
We have never stopped working on various parties so that dialogue and negotiations can take place to get us on the track of resolving the problems of denuclearization and peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. We cannot afford to wait for too long without dialogues taking place to see the situation having the possibility of worsening still.
Now, one of the reasons that it's pushing for dialogue and not economic sanctions is the last thing China wants, Max, as we often talk about, is a destabilised North Korea. Not only tens of millions of people potentially coming across the border into China, but also a reunified Korea, which could include a bigger US footprint right on China's doorstep. So China is sticking to that line. Whether now we know it's an ICBM, the picture changes, the equation changes, and China becomes more assertive and is prepared to push further. We'll wait and see. Hopefully we'll get a steer from MOFA, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Beijing, in probably about 30, 40 minutes from now.
OK. Andrew in Hong Kong, Kaori in Tokyo, and also Paula in Seoul. Thank you very much indeed. We're going to Go now, though, to Nick Robertson, because he's there to cover the G20 meeting. We've been talking about that. The threat from North Korea is sure to come up high now as Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin and other world leaders gather there in Germany. Nick, do you think we're more likely to get a meeting of minds on what to do about North Korea?
You know, I think it's hard to see a meeting of minds at the G20 because on so many issues there are so many differences between so many of the protagonists, and some of them, and here talking about President Trump, you know, the American leader is often the one that's looked to try to bring others together and perhaps set the agenda. But President Trump, his policies are being sort of interpreted more these days as sort of outliers, if you will. His you know, vision for how to do trade, for example, his vision for climate change is sort of, you know, out with the broader consensus. So in that context, it's harder to see in the bigger picture of how you reach agreements. But yes, when you have, you know, North Korea on the 4th of July, on the eve of the G20, testing its first ICBM, that certainly is going to get everyone's attention. If we just look at the last few days, President Trump has been making a number of phone calls to try to, you know, to try to move along his ideas to contain North Korea on this issue and, you know, convince others to find a way, China in particular, as we were just discussing here, to get them to get China to lay more pressure on North Korea. But to that effect, President Trump was already planning at the G20 on the margins a trilateral meeting with the South Koreans and with the Japanese. But the focus until now had been very much on President Trump's meeting with Vladimir Putin, their first meeting. The agenda of that meeting, not hard set. We were told it would be Ukraine, it would be Syria, but it wouldn't, it appears, be President Trump criticizing President Putin over the Russians hacking during the U.S. elections. That topic, we were told, wouldn't come up. That's been the focus of discussion, but absolutely now it certainly will appear that the focus is going to shift to the most pressing issue right now, which will seem to be North Korea.
OK, Nick, thank you. Certainly has changed the tone of those meetings, hasn't it? Joining me now is Inderjeet Palmer. He's Professor of International Politics at City University here in London. Thank you very much for joining us. We've had this news about North Korea just in the last hour. It happens on Independence Day as well. I mean, Nick there was saying it's July the 4th. That's a real provocation to a president who responds to provocation, actually.
Well, the thing is that North Korea is a fiercely independent country. It sees itself as having been under siege for many, many decades. And every time they get an opportunity to send a signal that they are not going to take any aggression as they see it lying down, whether there's sanctions or whether there's talk of other kinds of intervention, regime change and things like that. So North Korea's attitude hasn't changed. They are basically there. And I think around about every July, August, there's some major military exercises just off their coast as well.
Yes,
so they're
receiving provocation as well in their minds, right? But an intercontinental missile is something that Donald Trump said he wouldn't accept, and he has been pressuring China, hasn't he, to do something about this, and in his view, haven't done enough.
Yes.
Is there a risk that he might go it alone with military action?
I think it's very difficult because North Korea is actually pretty well armed. And as a result of that, the actual damage to the whole of the region, the number of casualties which are possible in Japan, South Korea, North Korea, and in China actually are in the millions. So the idea that an American president would just launch a preemptive strike of some form on Korea, which might then provoke a wider war, I think that would be very, very dangerous.
Because a lot of the fallout would be felt by China, which is why it's resisting regime change.
Well, I think there are different ideas about what China might be thinking about, because the amount of pressure on China has increased since President Trump took office. And I think there's also a great deal of irritation that there are larger questions for China and the United States and that region than North Korean military nuclear weapons. And I think they are getting irritated with China. And there are voices within that country which suggest, well, maybe the best thing to do is actually to change the regime by at China's behest, in order to get a friendly government there in order to maintain the division of that country.
Just explain the apprehension in China about getting too involved with North Korea, because they don't want a nuclearized North Korea, do they? We should emphasize that.
Yes.
So what's their issue with going in and responding?
Well, the big issue is that North Korea is dependent on China. North Korea, if you like, geopolitically, keeps that peninsula divided. It means the United States is a little bit further away than it could be. And that's why it might be better either to calm the situation down completely, or in the longer run, perhaps even get a more friendly regime which is more pliable and is pro-Chinese.
The point there being that if North Korea, if the regime collapsed, then South Korea and the US, by default, would fill that vacuum, and that would take the border up to China.
That is the big problem. And the Yalu River, we know, since the 1950s in the Korean War, has been a major key point of to kind of keep the other forces at bay. And I think China is not willing to risk that.
So when we look ahead to the G20, does China try to avoid this conversation altogether and focus on those other issues?
Well, I think you've got to focus on everything, because the theme of that G20 summit is an interconnected world. All of these issues are interconnected. And I think the main thing is that there are very, very large relationship questions between the United States and China in question of trade, question of the military build-up which is going on in that region. You will recall that there are now 3 American aircraft carriers in that region. So China is trying to be the big player in that region, in its own region, and it sees it as its backyard. And it sees Trump as possibly somebody who's threatening that.
Yeah, it's an epic meeting, isn't it, coming up in Germany? Obviously, all eyes as well on that sideline meeting between Putin and Trump. What are you expecting from that? Because a suggestion that, you know, the soundings from the White House are that this issue of hacking the US elections isn't going to come up.
Well, the fact is that Donald Trump denies that there was any kind of collusion with Vladimir Putin or the Russians of any form. He claims that he won fair and square, and that the Democrats are basically very sore, and they're willing to try to blame a foreign power for their defeat.
So why bring it up?
So why would he bring it up?
Yeah.
The Russians, I think, from their point of view, want to try to promote a particular kind of agenda as well, which is the sort of agenda which I think Donald Trump would find valuable, which is basically abandon things like NATO and big international security alliances, rely more on balance and power, maybe look back to Henry Kissinger and the sort of period of détente in the 1970s. They've got their own ideas about the way in which Donald Trump and the United States should behave towards them. So I think they'll be trying to pull the United States in that kind of direction.
It's going to be a fascinating meeting, isn't it?
I think so.
Lots to study. Thank you very much indeed. We'll have more on North Korea's latest missile launch, though, for you after this short break. A quick recap now on our breaking news. North Korea has announced it has successfully tested or test-fired an intercontinental ballistic missile. Earlier in a televised announcement, Pyongyang said Kim Jong-un ordered the test. The announcement comes a few hours after it launched the missile that may have landed in Japan's exclusive economic zone. South Korea's military says it landed in the waters east of the Korean peninsula after travelling some 930 kilometres, or about 600 miles. Japan's defence ministry says the missile reached an altitude of 2,500 kilometres, or just over 1,500 miles. It's worth noting that just last week, US advisers updated military options for President Trump in dealing with North Korea. Mr. Trump says he's concerned about Pyongyang's ability to target the US with one of its missiles, and US defense officials say they're worried about how North Korea is able to hide any testing until the last minute.
The threat is much more immediate now. And so it's clear that we can't repeat the same approach, failed approach of the past. What we have to do is prepare all options, because the president has made clear to us that he will not accept a nuclear power in North Korea and a threat that can target the United States and target the American population. Of course, he's equally concerned about our allies at South Korea, the South Korean population in particular.
Well, Jasper Kim is the founder of the Asia-Pacific Global Research Group. He joins us now from Seoul, South Korea. And the way many people interpreted those words coming from the US there is that a military option is on the table here, and if anything's going to prompt it, it is an intercontinental missile test.
Well, Max, a military option is always one of the options that the president has, and it's also an option that the other leaders in this region will also have to consider, but they will have a diametrically opposed view. They'll want to project peace, but Trump will want to project action. So it'll be interesting to see how this all kind of shakes out.
Oh, how's he going to respond, do you think? Because we can never quite predict what he's going to do, but he's really led up to this, hasn't he? There's been lots of tweeting around it. He's angry about it. He's concerned about it. He wants China to do more. And if China doesn't do more, the feeling is he has to respond in some way, and he could be quite aggressive.
Yeah, and this is exactly why North Korea is timing it as it is. And with the level of technology he wants to show off to the world, is that he wants to keep on going against Trump. Really what we have here is a clash of the titans, two alpha males going head to head. And in that respect, one of the best options for these two is actually, instead of going through the UN and sanctions and dialogue, that could be one option. But another option could be if these two met face to face and basically sniff each other out and try to figure out what is a solution. Now, both sides may say, well, that may not be the best option, but from the US perspective, from Trump's perspective, he could package it as a trade deal, North Korea, South Korea, or the US and the Korean Peninsula, and that's something that Trump is willing to talk about, talking about trade, which will therefore bring peace. And that may also be a self-interest of Kim Jong-un, North Korea's leader.
Yeah, do you imagine the two men meeting? That might be an option on the table. It's probably something that the North Korean leader would be up for, but do you think Donald Trump would go that far?
Well, past presidents haven't, but this president is different. We've seen it time and time again. And I think because of that, because of Trump's brashness, his directness, his pride of himself as a negotiator, this is exactly why he can differentiate himself from his presidential predecessors and say, why shouldn't I be able to not talk with this North Korean leader? I can't quite figure him out. But in a sense, he wants power. I want to project power. Together, we can meet together in the same room and basically try to figure out what common interests we have together. And that's something that hasn't been really played out before. It hasn't been done. A lot of talk has been going on about it, but there hasn't been any action, concerted action towards direct talks like this. And we know from North Korea's perspective, Kim Jong-un, what he wants to do is talk with past presidents. And of course, on top of that would be the current president, Donald Trump, in front of him.
So you're thinking that perhaps this build-up of rhetoric coming from Washington might not be building up towards any military action, but might be building up to a deal, effectively?
In a sense, it's a deal, but sort of a deal proposition before is to anchor people on the other side. Kim Jong-un, North Korea's leader, wants a perception of war that could break out on the brink here in the Korean Peninsula. And Trump, he wants something quite the opposite. He does not want war, of course, but what Kim Jong-un wants to project is power through his missile technology. And if he gets ICBM technology, then that basically increases his bargaining chips by tenfold. It's a 10x proposition. And everyone knows that. And so people are watching closely. But at any rate, that's what my belief is that Kim Jong-un wants a deal. He doesn't want provocation. That's really the fodder for other things that he really does want. He wants to sustain his power, basically have stability within his own regime, but not at the cost of his power.
OK, Jasper Kim, thank you very much indeed for joining us from Seoul.